Hello there. I'm a software developer working in the United Kingdom, and I am 51 years old at the moment, and have not worked as a software developer for very long, only about 3 years. Before that, I used to be a tour guide in the desert in Africa, and I did that job as being a tour guide and guide trainer for many years, over 2 decades. It was a pretty huge change to go from a guide in the desert to a software developer in the United Kingdom. And I think it's a bit of an interesting story, so this is the story. Going from being a guide in the desert to being a software developer is a pretty big change, and moving countries is a big change, and just the impact that COVID had on the world is a big change. Moving your family to a different country is a big change. So this whole course of events that would follow on from the outbreak of COVID had a pretty significant impact on my life, and it was a really, really challenging time for me. And so this story is a bit about how I face challenges, and we all face challenges, big and small. Some we choose to bring on ourselves, some are thrust upon us, or some variation in between. This is a story that I like to tell because I'm fairly proud of what I managed to achieve. And I'd love to know what things you do that are big challenges in your lives. Right now, a big challenge of mine is to learn Spanish, and that's been something that I've been doing for the last 2 years. I'm still learning how to be a good software developer. I'm trying to learn a bit about how to make YouTube videos. So I keep on having challenges, and I always enjoy the process of trying to face these things, and I love to hear about other people's challenges. So if you're doing anything interesting, challenging, or you have anything that you're really proud of, I'd love to know a bit of your story in the comments below. As it was for many people, the outbreak of COVID was a strange time for me and my family. I was working at the time in Namibia. Namibia is a pretty big country on the southwest of Africa, so it's just a little bit above South Africa, if you know where South Africa is. And Namibia is unusual as an African country in that it's really, really dry. And has extensive deserts. And I had become a really good guide in the desert. I was working at a lodge near an area called Sossusvlei, where there are giant red sand dunes. And I'd been working for this one particular lodge on and off for many years, but I just moved back there in October 2019. And it had been a really busy time. I was out in the middle of nowhere. I was the lodge is about 400 kilometers from where my wife and kids were living in the capital city. And so I'd be out there for long periods of time, isolated from my family, working in the desert. So I was there in March of 2020, and I'm not sure exactly of when the timing was, but we'd been incredibly busy. The lodge was packed every day and was a high-end lodge, so it was a pretty high workload. And to a large extent, we weren't really keeping up with events in the world because we were just working flat out, long hours every day. I was doing astronomy, where I'd often be out late at night and often up early in the morning, so it was a pretty hectic time. And just before everything changed, we started to get a bit of news filtering through just from our guests coming in. And I remember one particular afternoon, I'd gone out with a junior guide who was just taking his first few guests out after completion of his initial training. And so I went along on a short afternoon drive with him. We went out to the sand dunes with two guests who'd flown in without enough time to do a full afternoon activity. So we just went out to a beautiful area at the sand dunes, set up some drinks for them to enjoy the sunset over the sand dunes, and give them a bit of an introduction of what life in the desert is. As we stood chatting over drinks while the sun was setting, they were telling us about how things were starting to close down in Europe and the impact that COVID was having around the world. And it was the first time that I really got a glimpse at just how significant the changes would be with COVID. It didn't take very long from then. Things were changing. Pretty soon we had heard that the first cases of COVID had appeared in Namibia, and were told that Namibia would be going into a lockdown. This happened pretty rapidly. The first lockdown in Namibia was the 28th of March 2020, and I don't remember exactly the timing, but it was a pretty complicated situation for us at the lodge because we had a whole lot of staff, about 30 people, and we really had just one way to get them out at that time because little else was moving. We were in the middle of nowhere. There was no public transport or any other means to get people out. And so we had to use our small truck to do multiple trips. It was pretty important that we rushed because many of the people from the capital city where we dropped them off still had another day or two's travel to get on to where their homes are. So some people lived way up in the north, over 1,000 kilometers away from the lodge. And so it was a pretty hectic time. And we only had one driver for the truck, so he had to do 3 trips in all. The only other person with a license to drive the truck was myself. And so when our driver had done 2 trips back to back, almost 24 hours of driving, I took over for the final trip. It was already evening of that day, and we had no choice but to drive. Normally we'd never drive at night because it's fairly dangerous with wildlife out on the roads, but we had little choice at that time. So I took the final trip. The driver curled up in the back and fell asleep for the trip back. I loaded the truck full of the last guests to leave the lodge. And it was a pretty eerie feeling driving out into the pitch dark. It's a 7-hour drive with that small truck, especially when you're being careful of wildlife at night. It takes a really long time. So I'd had a bit of sleep, but still driving through the night is always a challenge. And knowing that I had the lives of all the people in the back of the vehicle was a significant thing. So it was a strange feeling that things were drastically changing in the world. On our way back, many of the shops that we'd normally stop at for toilet stops or buying some snacks had already closed down, so we could see just how much the country was shutting down. And there were police along the way who were checking where we were coming from. So it was really a strange time. And so drove through the night. Early in the morning, just as the sunlight was appearing, I made it to the bus depot where our staff would catch the various transports back to wherever their homes were, and drove into my own house. And the little truck that we had would stay with me for the next while during the lockdown. Once I parked that little truck at my house, we settled in for a period of time that we didn't know how long it would be at home. So I was back with my family. For a lot of time, I hadn't spent a great deal of time with my family because I'd been really busy and my work was always away from home. For the previous few years, I'd often spent 200 days of the year away from home. So it was a nice chance to spend some time with my kids and try to relax a bit. We'd been incredibly busy at the lodge, so it was a break that I could use. But I'm not always very good at relaxing. And so within a day or so after settling in, I thought this is a nice chance to do something interesting. So despite being a tour guide, I had a long interest in computers. I had gone to school in Kenya in the 1980s. But very fortunately, I'd done a little bit of programming. Most of that was in BASIC, and most of it was around about my middle years of school, around about age 12 to 15, I'd guess. And hadn't done very interesting things, but it was always pretty fun. And in the holidays, we spent some time on interesting computers, ZX Spectrum Plus and Commodore 64, trying to write games with some friends who were also enjoying programming. But from then, programming kind of became something I lost touch with. I didn't even have a computer for a long time. In my early years in guiding in Namibia, we didn't have internet. We were out in the middle of nowhere before smartphones were a thing. I didn't really have a great deal of connection with computers. But then around about 2005, my wife and I bought a laptop to share between the two of us. And she had an old HTML book sitting around that she had never worked through. And so I thought, this is something fun to get into. So I worked my way through the book and learned some HTML. And then from there, I started learning some JavaScript and then went on to learn Python and spent about a month reading through various Python books. But the one that really stuck out to me was a book called Dive into Python, which I'm not sure if that's still around, but it was a really, really good book to learning Python. And so Python became my primary language for doing anything useful with. And I did some back end of websites and things like that with Python, but nothing much, all just small stuff, and never made much out of it. And then for a while I sort of switched over to more low level stuff. I really got into C. I worked my way through the famous K&R book and wrote some things in C. My son had been in hospital for a while at one stage, and during the time that I was sitting around with him in hospital, I wrote a Sudoku solver, which at that time had been the biggest program I'd ever written, and I was kind of enjoying C. But then I got invited to the first Python Namibia conference. Out of that conference, we ended up launching a Python society in Namibia, and so I joined in. I was never a very active leader in that society, mainly because I was away from town so much of the time and often didn't really want to spend time with people when I got back, because my job was all about facing people all the time, and I'm a pretty introverted person, so I enjoyed using my time off to be alone. But it did bring Python back into focus, and I did some interesting things. I did manage to run some courses with kids and gave a couple talks here and there, ran a couple workshops, and tried a little bit here and there to help people learn Python. And obviously when you teach, you learn more yourself. So my Python was coming along. I was playing around a lot with Linux as well during my off times and enjoying that. And so software had become something that I enjoyed. And so when the lockdowns provided time to do something, I thought, let me settle down and do some programming and do some studying. So my first couple of days, I started doing that. But pretty quickly, I was starting to think, maybe this is a worthwhile transition to do, something that's always interested me. And I was really, really concerned about the future of tourism with the impact of COVID. I am a British citizen, even though I hadn't lived in the UK. I'd spent my whole life in Africa, but I am British, and my parents are here in the UK. I've got other family. My sister is here. And so we thought this might be a good time to move. I was also wanting to spend some time with my boys before they become adults, and instead of being out on the road all the time. There were various reasons for making this decision, but either it was still going to be a really big challenge. And to be honest, I had no idea how big a challenge it would be. It certainly wasn't going to be easy, but I had a chat with my sister and we started making plans to make this big move. After making the decision to leave my job at the lodge, things happened fairly quickly. I sent in a resignation and got a request back from the lodge, from the company, to keep on working for a few months, to come back to the desert for 3 months to do some training. They also asked me to do some marketing, to do some videos for marketing, which were, some of them were released on YouTube and various other places. I did training with some of the guides and worked on some of the lodge's documentation, helped them write up the history since I'd been around the lodge for a long time. So there were various things. So I went back to the desert. We were all alone. There was, within about a 100-kilometer radius, there was less than 50 people. So it was a pretty strange time out in the desert. And that lasted until about September. Then I went back home and finalized a few things, sold my car, got rid of a few things, and moved to the UK. When I arrived in the UK, I immediately had to go into quarantine, and so I was quarantine lasted about 14 days. And once I came out of quarantine, the UK went back into lockdown. So the whole time at the lodge, my time back, the quarantines and the new lockdown, I just spent the time intensively studying. So one of the biggest successes for me through this time was just taking it as if it was my job. Once I stopped working at the lodge, even when I was at the lodge, I was working in the mornings until the mid-afternoon, and then I'd go home and then I'd spend the rest of the day studying. When I moved to the UK and had lockdowns and quarantine, I just spent my time as if I had a day job, 8 to 5 or whatever, and even into the evenings. I was extremely determined to get it. And then slowly but surely I started applying for jobs and realized that it was going to be a really uphill battle. I didn't have a degree in computer science. I had never done a boot camp. I didn't have money left to do any boot camps or anything like that. It was really a challenge to get a job. And I think there were a few things that I did well. At first, I was sort of just applying to things as I found them. But later on, I realized that it was really demotivating to spend time, and it was time consuming. So I wanted to focus on studying. So what I did is Monday through Thursday, I was just studying and applying myself to just getting better at my skills, and spending the entire Friday, every Friday, sending out as many applications as I could. That allowed me to write really good applications. I made sure that every single application was written specifically for the job I was applying for. And it took quite a while. I only managed to land a job in April 2021. So it had taken me around about a year of pretty intensively studying software in any spare time that I had before I managed to land the job. My first job was in London. I was eventually let go from that one because I just wasn't quite up to the standard that they needed. But I managed to work there for more than a year. I've had a couple changes since then, so it's been a challenge. I've had to reapply to new jobs. I've gone through the interview process and the job application process a few times. But I'm in a job now that I'm really enjoying. I'm fitting in well. I'm managing to work as a software developer. So for me, I was 48 when I moved to the UK and became a software developer. I think that's something that I can be quite proud of. A lot of people would consider that age to be a little bit old for getting into this line of work, especially these days. But I'm fairly proud of the fact that I managed to do it. So I think it's just a nice story of determination and the power of setting your mind to doing something and accomplishing it. So thank you so much for watching my video.